The porcelain mug slipped from Sarah's fingers, shattering against the kitchen floor as the television anchor introduced a woman who had been dead to her family for 10 years. Sarah stood frozen by the counter, her 64-year-old hands trembling, her eyes locked on the glowing screen. A regal, silver-haired woman in a dark, tailored blazer was speaking calmly to a local Chicago news host about a major donation to a regional hospice network. Her voice, smooth, measured, and quiet, sent a cold wave of horror straight through Sarah's chest. That voice belonged to Clara. Clara was Sarah's older sister, but Clara had not spoken a word in a decade. For 10 long years, Clara had been lying in room 212 at St. Jude's Rest Home, 3 miles down the road, tucked beneath a pale yellow blanket, sustained by a feeding tube and a humming heart monitor. Sarah had visited her every single Tuesday afternoon. She had brushed Clara's thinning hair, held her cold, motionless hand, and read aloud from old novels while the rain tapped against the glass. Yet here was Clara, sitting upright in a television studio, smiling with calm authority, her eyes sharp and lively. Sarah dropped to her knees, ignoring the sharp fragments of broken ceramic pressing into her palms. She crawled closer to the screen, her breath hitching as the camera zoomed in on the woman's left earlobe. There it was, the faint, crescent-shaped scar from a childhood dog bite. It was Clara. There was no doubt about it. The woman on television smoothed her skirt and announced that the charitable foundation bore her birth name, a name Sarah had not heard spoken aloud since the rainy autumn evening the police knocked on her door to report Clara's car burning at the bottom of the old quarry ravine. Sarah's fingers shook violently as she grabbed her phone from the counter and dialed the direct line to Dr. Harrison, the head administrator at St. Jude's. Dr. Harrison had been a close family friend for 30 years. He was the man who had sat with Sarah in the hospital waiting room the night of the crash, holding her hand while the doctors explained that Clara had suffered catastrophic brain damage. He was the man who had guided Sarah through 10 years of quiet, exhausting grief. The phone rang twice before Dr. Harrison answered. His voice was rushed, devoid of his usual warm, grandfatherly cadence. In the background, clear as a bell, echoed the metallic chime of a public address system announcing a flight departure to London. "Sarah, I'm in the middle of urgent business tonight," Harrison said, his breathing shallow. "Can this wait until morning?" "Dr. Harrison," Sarah whispered, her throat so tight she could barely form the words. "I'm watching the 6 o'clock news. Who is on my screen right now?" The line fell into an absolute, suffocating silence. On the screen, the interview ended, transitioning to a commercial, but the silence on the phone felt heavy and dangerous. "Sarah," Dr. Harrison said, his tone shifting entirely. The hurry vanished, replaced by a low, desperate wait. "Listen to me very carefully. Turn off the television. Do not call anyone. Go back to your living room and stay there until I can reach you." "What are you talking about?" Sarah demanded, her voice cracking. "I just saw my sister. She's alive. She's standing on her own 2 feet. Who have I been visiting every Tuesday for 10 years? "Sarah, please," Dr. Harrison whispered, the faint airport chimes sounding again in the background. "You don't understand what was at stake. If you go to the facility tonight, you will ruin everything we tried to preserve. Stay home." The call disconnected with a sharp click. Sarah stared at her phone. Airport announcements? Dr. Harrison was supposed to be on call at the facility. Why was he at an international terminal on a Tuesday night? Her husband, Robert, would be home from his evening walk in less than 20 minutes. Robert had been her rock through the dark decade following Clara's accident. He was the one who managed their modest household finances, the one who took over writing the monthly care checks when Sarah was too heartbroken to look at the paperwork, and the one who gently held her on the nights she cried herself to sleep. Sarah picked up her raincoat. She could not wait for Robert. A cold, suffocating doubt had taken root in her mind, and she knew that if she did not look into room 212 with her own eyes tonight, she would lose her mind entirely. Hungered. The drive to St. Jude's Rest Home was blurred by steady rain and the harsh glare of streetlights against Sarah's windshield. Her mind raced back through 10 years of Tuesday visits, searching for tiny details she had overlooked. She remembered how Dr. Harrison had always insisted on meeting her in the lobby before she walked down the hall to Clara's room. She remembered how the nursing staff always kept the blinds drawn, claiming Clara's eyes had grown hypersensitive to light, and most of all she remembered the strict barrier protocol. "It's for her protection, Sarah," Dr. Harrison had told her year after year. "Her immune system is completely compromised. Please keep your gloves on and do not touch the bandages around her jaw and neck." Sarah had obeyed without question. Why wouldn't she? She loved her sister, and she trusted Dr. Harrison. She had trusted her husband, who handled the insurance forms and paid the heavy co-pays without ever complaining about the financial drain on their retirement savings. When Sarah pulled into the parking lot of St. Jude's, the long 2-story brick building looked dark and forbidding under the storm clouds. The lot was nearly empty, save for a single maintenance van parked near the back. Sarah stepped out into the biting wind. Instead of using the main glass doors, which were locked for the night, she walked around to the side entrance used by staff and long-term family members. She pressed the keypad digits she had memorized years ago. 0412, the day of Clara's birthday. The lock clicked open. The air inside smelled of bleach, old floor wax, and lavender, a familiar scent that had comforted Sarah for years, but now made her stomach churn. She walked down the quiet corridor of the private care wing. Her rubber-soled shoes made no sound against the linoleum floor. The facility was eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of a floor buffer on another level. When she reached room 212, Sarah stopped. The brass nameplate beside the doorframe still read, Elena Vance. Sarah's hand hovered over the silver handle. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She took a slow, deep breath, pressed down on the handle, and pushed the heavy door open. The room was dim, illuminated only by the pale green light of a vitals monitor sitting on the bedside table. The steady, rhythmic beep, beep, beep filled the silence. Under the heavy yellow blanket, a frail body lay motionless. Sarah's breath hitched. She stepped closer to the bed, her hands trembling as she reached toward the white sheets. Was the woman on television an impossible look-alike? Had her mind played a cruel trick on her? She reached the edge of the mattress and slowly pulled back the sheet covering the patient's face. The breath left Sarah's lungs in a silent gasp. The woman lying in the bed was not Clara. She was an elderly woman, visibly older than Clara, with deeply lined skin, thin white hair, and hollow cheeks. She was deeply asleep, breathing faint, shallow breaths through a plastic cannula. The plastic wristband wrapped around her frail forearm did not say Elena Vance. It read, Gable, Margaret, room 212. Sarah stumbled backward, her heel catching on the legs of a visitor's chair. She grabbed the edge of the dresser to steady herself, her mind spinning out of control. Clara was not here. She had not been here. For 10 years, Sarah had been sitting beside a total stranger, brushing a stranger's hair, and pouring out her heart to a woman who could not hear her, while someone was collecting money to keep this bed occupied. Before Sarah could process the nightmare, the heavy door clicked open behind her. Sarah spun around, her chest heaving. Standing in the threshold, illuminated by the corridor light, was her husband, Robert. Robert stood perfectly still, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his dark coat. His graying hair was damp from the rain, and his face was pale, lined with a deep, crushing exhaustion. He did not look surprised to see her there. Sarah, Robert said softly, his voice trembling slightly. You shouldn't have come here tonight. Sarah stared at him, feeling as though the floor was sliding out from under her feet. Robert? What? Who is this? Where is Clara? Robert closed the room door behind him, stepping into the dim green glow of the monitor. He did not look at the sleeping woman in the bed. He looked only at Sarah, his eyes filled with a painful, agonizing regret. Clara isn't here, Sarah, Robert whispered. She hasn't been here for a long time. A long time? Sarah's voice rose, sharp and panicked. What does that mean, Robert? I've been coming here every Tuesday for 10 years. You drove me here when the snow was too thick. You paid the bills every month. Who is this woman? Her name is Margaret, Robert said quietly, looking down at his shoes. She was brought here 8 years ago from a state facility that was closing down. She had no family left, no one to visit her. Sarah felt cold sweat break out across her neck. 8 years? You mean Clara was here for 2 years and then she died? Did she die 10 years ago and you didn't tell me? No, Robert said, taking a step toward her, his hands coming out of his pockets in a pleading gesture. Clara didn't die, Sarah. But I swear to you, I didn't know everything from the start. You have to believe me. Believe you? Sarah backed away until her shoulders hit the wall beside the dresser. You looked me in the eye every single week. When I cried on the couch because I missed my sister, you held me. You let me sit in this chair for 10 years talking to a stranger. I did it because I was trying to hold our life together. Robert's voice cracked, a rare flare of emotion breaking through his usually stoic demeanor. When Clara disappeared after the accident, Dr. Harrison came to me. He showed me what was happening. If I had told you the truth back then, you would have gone looking for her. You would have destroyed yourself trying to find answers that weren't there. Sarah shook her head, tears blurring her vision. Disappeared? What are you saying? The police found her car burned out in the ravine. The car burned, Sarah, but Clara wasn't in it when it went over the edge, Robert said softly. He reached into his inner coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather ledger. It was an old bank record book, its corners frayed. Clara didn't crash because of an accident. She was running. Sarah stared at the ledger in his shaking hand. Running from what? From the money, Robert said. From what your father left behind. Sarah took the small ledger from Robert's hands. Her fingers were so cold she could barely turn the yellowed pages. For decades, Sarah and Clara had lived under the assumption that their late father, Arthur Vance, was simply a respectable, moderately successful suburban accountant who had died of a sudden stroke when Sarah was in her 30s. He had left behind a modest house and a small life insurance policy that paid for his funeral. But as Sarah scanned the neatly handwritten columns in the ledger, written in her father's unmistakable, precise script, she saw numbers that made no sense. Millions of dollars moving through small, regional holding companies between 1994 and 2004. Dad didn't just keep books for local businesses, Sarah, Robert said gently, watching her face as the reality settled in. He was managing offshore tax dodges and private slush funds for some of the most powerful corporate executives in the city. When he died, he left behind a massive structural shortfall, nearly $4 million in uncollected, unregistered corporate debt that he had personally guaranteed to protect his clients. Sarah looked up, her mind racing. And they came after Clara? They came after his estate, Robert corrected. When Arthur died, the creditors realized the money was gone. But Arthur had structured his personal assets into an irrevocable family trust tied to his daughters. The trust had a specific cruel clause written into it decades ago. If either daughter declared personal bankruptcy or faced major legal judgments, her share was liquidated to satisfy creditors. But as long as both daughters were living, healthy, and legally solvent, the principal remained entirely locked and untouched until both turned 65. Sarah blinked, trying to grasp the legal knot. Clara was 38 when the crash happened. I was 34. Exactly, Robert said. The creditors couldn't touch the trust money while you two were alive and fine. But they began threatening Clara, pressing her to sign over her rights or force a liquidation. She was the older sister. She was managing Dad's old files. She knew who these people were, powerful men with lawyers and enforcement who could ruin lives without breaking a sweat. If she fought them openly, they would have targeted you too. So Clara made a choice. She faked her death, Sarah whispered, the ledger trembling in her hand. She tried to, Robert said. She staged the crash at the ravine to make it look like she had perished. But the fire didn't burn the car completely enough to satisfy an insurance investigation. If the court ruled her missing rather than dead, her estate would be frozen for 7 years, leaving the trust vulnerable to lawsuits. So Dr. Harrison stepped in. Sarah remembered Dr. Harrison's voice on the phone less than an hour ago, the frantic tone, the background noise of the airport. Harrison was deep in personal debt, Robert continued softly. Clara offered him a way out. Harrison agreed to certify to the state and the insurance companies that Clara had been pulled from the vehicle alive, but in an irreversible, non-responsive coma. A comatose patient cannot be sued, cannot sign documents, and cannot forfeit trust rights. It froze the legal battles instantly. The creditors couldn't force a liquidation of a comatose woman's family trust. Sarah's throat felt raw, and Dr. Harrison kept her listed on the rolls here. For 2 years, Clara actually lived in a hidden room in the basement of the old annex while Harrison worked out her new identities, Robert confessed, his eyes shiny with tears. Then she left the country. But to keep the legal shield alive, to keep the estate frozen and the creditors from coming after you, the bed in room 2112 had to remain occupied on paper. Harrison arranged for Margaret Gable to be transferred here under Clara's insurance file. The monthly payments from the trust covered Margaret's care and padded Harrison's pocket. Sarah looked from the ledger to her husband's face. The story was logical. It was brilliant, methodical, and cold. But it opened a far deeper, more agonizing wound in her chest. "And when did you find out, Robert?" Sarah asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "Day 1? Robert swallowed hard. "No. I swear to you, Sarah, for the first 2 years I believed Clara was in that bed just like you did. I sat in the waiting room with you. I held you when you cried. Then when?" "Year 3, Robert said, his voice barely audible. "Dr. Harrison called me into his office privately. The insurance audits were tightening. He needed someone to co-sign the annual medical guardianship renewals because you were too emotionally distraught to handle the legal paperwork. He told me the truth, Sarah. He showed me that Clara was gone, living abroad under another name. He told me that if I blew the whistle, Harrison would go to prison, Clara would be prosecuted for fraud, and the creditors would immediately seize the family trust, leaving us bankrupt and tied up in federal court for the rest of our lives. Sarah felt a tear slide down her cheek, hot and bitter. So you chose the money? No. Robert took a sudden step toward her, his face contorted in pain. I didn't care about the damn money, Sarah. I chose you. Harrison told me that if the truth came out, the people Clara ran from would realize they'd been duped for 3 years. They would come looking for answers from the only person left, you. I was terrified, Sarah. I was terrified they would hurt you, or that the shock would destroy you. I agreed to sign the guardianship papers every year to keep the shield up, to keep our quiet, peaceful life safe. Sarah stared at him, her chest aching with a profound, terrifying emptiness. You kept me in a cage of grief for 7 years to keep me safe? I know what it looks like, Robert pleaded, his voice breaking. I know you look at me now and see a stranger. But every Tuesday when you came home from this place, eyes swollen from crying, I wanted to tell you. God help me, Sarah. I wanted to pull you into my arms and scream the truth, but every time I looked at your face, I froze. I thought, if I tell her today, she will never look at me the same way again. She will hate me. So I waited for the day the trust matured. I waited for the day Clara promised she would fix it. And Harrison, Sarah asked, her mind connecting the final piece. Why was he at the airport tonight? Because Clara made her public reappearance today, Robert said quietly. The 10-year statute of limitations on the old estate debts expired last month. Clara is legally safe now, but Harrison isn't. He committed medical fraud for a decade. As soon as Clara went on live television in Chicago to launch her new company, Harrison knew the house of cards was falling. He packed a bag and bought a one-way ticket out of the country before the state medical board could question him. Sarah stood in the dim, green-lit room, listening to the steady, mechanical breathing of Margaret Gable. Her life of 30 years, her marriage, her grief, her memories of her sister, had been crafted by 3 people who claimed to be protecting her, a sister who ran away, a doctor who took a payout, and a husband who decided that her grief was a small price to pay for her safety. Where is she, Robert? Sarah asked, her voice eerie in its calmness. Where is Clara right now? Robert reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded slip of paper with a hotel address written in dark ink. She's at the Drake Hotel in Chicago. She's waiting for me to bring you to her. Sarah took the paper, folded it neatly, and placed it in her coat pocket. She looked at Robert, the man she had loved for 3 decades, whose face was now etched with a quiet, pathetic despair. I'm going to Chicago, Sarah said quietly. Alone. Sarah, please. Do not follow me, Robert, Sarah said, her voice firm, devoid of anger, which made it infinitely more terrifying. If you step foot in that car with me, I will never speak to you again. Go home. Sit in the quiet house you built on 7 years of lies, and wait for me to call. Robert stood frozen, his mouth opening as if to argue, but the look in Sarah's eyes stopped him. It was not the look of a frail, grieving woman. It was the look of someone who had just woken up from a 10-year sleep. He slowly bowed his head and stepped aside, letting her pass. The drive to downtown Chicago took 90 minutes through the pouring rain. Sarah drove in complete silence, refusing to turn on the radio or look at the clock on the dashboard. Her mind was remarkably clear. The shock that had paralyzed her in her kitchen 3 hours ago had burned away, leaving behind a cold, crystalline focus. She was no longer looking for answers about what had happened. She understood the mechanics now. She was going to demand an answer for something far more important, what it had cost. When she arrived at the Drake Hotel, the grand lobby was filled with plush carpets, crystal chandeliers, and the muted chatter of wealthy guests. It felt like another world entirely from the sterile, bleach-scented corridors of St. Jude's. Sarah walked up to the reception desk, her coat still damp from the rain. Room for Elena Vance, please. The clerk checked the system, offered a polite smile, and directed her to the executive suite on the 12th floor. When Sarah reached room 1214, she did not hesitate. She raised her hand and knocked 3 times on the heavy oak door. A moment later, the door swung open. Clara stood in the doorway. Up close, without the camera lenses and studio lighting, she looked her 66 years. There were fine lines around her eyes, and her silver hair was pulled back elegantly. She was wearing a soft cream cashmere sweater and holding a glass of water. When Clara's eyes landed on Sarah, the glass in her hand trembled slightly. Her composure, built over a decade of hiding in the shadows, visibly fractured. Sarah, Clara whispered, her voice catching in her throat. My God, Sarah! Clara took a step forward, her arms opening instinctively to embrace her younger sister. You came. Robert called me. He said you knew. Sarah stood perfectly still on the carpeted threshold, her hands buried in her raincoat pockets. She did not step into the hug. She did not move back. She simply looked at her sister's face, tracing the familiar lines of a woman she had mourned for 10 years. Clara's arms slowly fell back to her sides. A painful, heavy silence stretched between them in the doorway. Are you going to invite me in, Clara? Sarah asked quietly. Of course, Clara said quickly, wiping a sudden tear from the corner of her eye. Please, come in. The suite was vast and luxurious, overlooking the dark, rain-swept expanse of Lake Michigan. On the desk lay stacks of legal documents, press releases, and a sleek laptop. Sarah walked into the center of the room, turning to face her sister. You look remarkably well for a woman who spent 10 years in a vegetative state. Clara closed her eyes for a brief second, taking a shaky breath. I know how cruel it looks, Sarah. I know what you must think of me. Do you? Sarah's voice was remarkably gentle, which seemed to cut Clara deeper than a scream would have. Tell me what I think, Clara, because for 10 years I thought you were trapped in a dark room, unable to hear me when I read to you. I thought about you every single Tuesday. I didn't take vacations because I couldn't bear the thought of missing a visit. I didn't move to a bigger house because we needed to keep our expenses low to cover your care co-pays. Sarah, I had to do it, Clara said, her voice rising with an intense, desperate sincerity. She walked over to the desk and pointed at the papers. Dad didn't just leave us in debt, Sarah. He left us at the mercy of men who would have dismantled our lives piece by piece. If I had stayed, if I had tried to fight them in court as Clara Vance, they would have tied us to Dad's financial fraud. We would have lost everything. Our savings, our home, our reputation. You would have been dragged into federal depositions for years. So you sacrificed yourself? Sarah asked softly. Yes, Clara said, tears finally spilling over her lashes. I gave up 10 years of my life. Do you think it was easy living under assumed names in Toronto and London? Do you think it was easy watching your life from afar through private investigators' reports, knowing I couldn't send you a birthday card, couldn't call you when I was sick, couldn't tell you I was alive? I lived in exile, Sarah. I sacrificed my youth, my name, and my freedom so that when the legal statutes expired, I could come back and rebuild what Dad destroyed. Sarah looked at her sister's impassioned face. She saw the genuine pain in Clara's eyes. Clara was not a monster. She was not a cold-blooded villain who had abandoned her family for money. She was a woman who genuinely believed she had played the hero in a tragic story. And that was the most heartbreaking realization of all. You think you sacrificed your life, Clara, Sarah said, stepping closer to her. But you didn't just sacrifice yours. You sacrificed mine, and you didn't even ask for my permission. Clara blinked, taken aback. I was protecting you. No, Clara, Sarah said, her voice dropping to a sharp, clear truth. You were protecting the family name. You were playing chess with men who threatened your pride. You made the executive decision that my grief was a manageable cost in your grand strategy. You left me in a room with a dying, lonely woman named Margaret Gable. And you let me pour my real, precious human love into an empty space for 10 years so that your legal shield wouldn't crack. Clara shook her head defensively. If you had known, Sarah, you couldn't have hidden it. You're too honest. You would have looked at the nurses differently. You would have slipped up. They were watching you, Sarah. In the first 2 years, Dad's former associates had private investigators watching our house and tracking your car to St. Jude's. Your genuine grief was the only thing that convinced them I was truly gone. Sarah stood frozen as those words echoed through the luxurious hotel room. Your genuine grief was the only thing that convinced them. A cold wave of clarity washed over Sarah. It was true. Her tears, her heartbreak, her weekly visits, they had been the primary weapon in Clara's war. Sarah's suffering had been the camouflage. You used my heart as a shield, Sarah whispered. Clara reached out, trying to grab Sarah's hands, her face contorted in agony. Sarah, please. Look at what we have now. The foundation is launched. The money in the trust is fully unlocked and clear. You never have to worry about retirement, about health care, about anything ever again. We can be sisters again. We can make up for the lost time. Sarah looked down at Clara's trembling hands resting on her coat sleeves. She looked at the crescent-shaped scar on Clara's earlobe, the small detail that had brought her here tonight. Slowly, gently, Sarah took Clara's wrists and removed her sister's hands from her coat. You can't buy back 10 years, Clara, Sarah said softly. You can't write a charitable check to erase 700 Tuesdays spent sitting beside a stranger. Sarah, please don't walk away, Clara sobbed, dropping all her regal composure, looking small and fragile in the vast room. I did it because I loved you. I did it to keep you safe. Maybe you did, Sarah said, looking deeply into her sister's eyes. I believe that you thought you were saving me, but you saved a version of me that existed 10 years ago. The woman standing here tonight doesn't need your foundation, Clara, and she doesn't need your money. Sarah turned and walked toward the suite door. Sarah! Clara called out, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. Where are you going? Sarah stopped at the door, her hand resting on the brass handle. She did not look back. I'm going to spend my time on something real, Sarah said quietly. She opened the door and walked out into the carpeted hallway, closing the door softly behind her, leaving Clara alone in her penthouse suite. The rain had stopped by the time Sarah reached her car in the hotel parking garage. The early morning sky was beginning to lighten into a pale, clear gray over Lake Michigan. Sarah did not drive home to her house, nor did she drive back to St. Jude's immediately. Instead, she drove to a quiet 24-hour diner 3 blocks from her neighborhood. She sat by the window, ordered a cup of black coffee, and watched the city wake up. She thought about her father, a man whose quiet dishonesty had set a tragedy in motion. She thought about Clara, who had turned herself into a soldier to fix it, losing her humanity in the process. And she thought about Robert, sitting alone in their dark living room, waiting for a phone call that would determine the rest of his life. At 7 o'clock in the morning, Sarah pulled her phone from her coat pocket and called Robert. He answered on the very first ring. His voice was raspy, broken, as if he hadn't breathed in hours. Sarah? Robert, she said quietly. Are you all right? Where are you? He asked, his voice trembling with terror and hope. Sarah looked at her reflection in the dark diner window. I talked to Clara. A long pause hung on the line. And? Robert asked softly. I left her, Sarah said. She's going to live her life in Chicago. She has her foundation, her name, and her money. That's what she wanted. Robert let out a shaky breath. Sarah, what about us? What do you want me to do? Do you want me to pack my things? Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the exhaustion of the night heavy on her shoulders. She remembered 30 years of marriage. She remembered the genuine kindness Robert had shown her every single day, paired with the terrible, agonizing choice he had made to keep her in the dark. He had not betrayed her for money or malice. He had betrayed her out of a terrifying, misguided cowardice wrapped in love. Forgiveness was not a switch she could flip this morning. The trust between them was broken, shattered like the coffee mug on her kitchen floor. Rebuilding it, if it could be rebuilt at all, would take years of painful honesty. I'm coming home, Robert, Sarah said quietly. We are going to clean up the broken glass in the kitchen, and then we are going to talk about every single day of the last 7 years. You are going to tell me everything, without lying, without omitting a single word. And if you lie to me even once, I will leave and never come back. On the other end of the line, Robert began to cry, quiet, choked sobs of profound relief and gratitude. Okay, Sarah. Okay. I'll tell you everything, I swear to God. I'll be home in 20 minutes, Sarah said and hung up the phone. 2 weeks later, the morning air was crisp and cold as autumn fully settled over the town. Sarah walked down the quiet, carpeted corridor of St. Jude's Rest Home. The facility looked different to her now, less like a shrine of long grief and more like what it simply was, a quiet place where forgotten people spent their final days. Dr. Harrison was gone, having resigned under sudden personal circumstances, and a new administrative team was reviewing the facility's records. But Sarah was not interested in the administrators or the legal fallout that was slowly gathering in the background. She reached room 212. The brass nameplate beside the door had been changed. It no longer read Elena Vance. It read Margaret Gable. Sarah opened the door softly. The room was quiet, illuminated by the gentle morning sunlight streaming through the unblinded window. On the bed, Margaret Gable lay still, her breathing quiet and faint. Sarah walked over to the visitor's chair. For 10 years, she had sat in this chair, believing she was fulfilling a painful duty to a tragic memory. She had sat here with a heart full of grief, resentment, and helpless agony. Today, Sarah carried no grief. She carried no secrets. She sat down in the wooden chair, pulled a hardcover book from her bag, and looked at the elderly woman sleeping in the bed. Margaret had no family, no visitors, and no one to hold her hand as her life quietly waned. Sarah reached out, took Margaret's frail, cold hand in her own warm fingers, and gently squeezed it. "Good morning, Margaret," Sarah said softly, her voice steady and full of life. "It's Tuesday. I'm going to read to you today." Sarah opened the book and began to read aloud, her voice filling the quiet room. She was no longer a pawn in a dead sister's war. She was no longer a victim of a husband's well-meaning lie. She was simply a woman who had chosen, on her own terms, to give love to a person who needed it. And as the autumn sun warmed the windowsill, Sarah finally felt at peace.